Hello everyone. Let me know where you're watching from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My name is Margaret and I am 42 years old. For the last 5 years my primary job title hasn't been registered nurse, which is what my degree says, but caregiver. I gave up my apartment, my career, and what felt like the entire trajectory of my life to move back into my childhood home and care for my ailing father. It was a sacrifice made out of love, a choice I would make again in a heartbeat. I never expected that my own brother Richard would see my sacrifice not as an act of love, but as a poor financial investment. He thought he could fly in with his tailored suit and his condescending sympathy, and simply liquidate our family's history, selling our home and moving our father into a facility as if he were just an inconvenient piece of inventory. He thought his wealth gave him the final say. But before I dive into the story of the family meeting that changed everything, the day my brother's cold-hearted plan was exposed for all to see, do me a favor. If you've ever felt undervalued or had your sacrifices dismissed by the very people who should have been cheering you on, hit that like button. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. This is a community for people who understand that strength often grows in the quiet, thankless corners of life. My brother never counted on my ledger. It wasn't a book of dollars and cents, but a meticulous record of every late-night emergency, every whispered reassurance, every moment of fear and grace. He never counted on the 5 years of evidence I had collected, and he certainly never counted on the one piece of paper that made his money, his influence, and his opinion utterly worthless. It all began on a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of day that holds the false promise of warmth while a stubborn chill still clings to the air. I was on shift at the hospital, a grueling 12-hour run in the cardiac unit. The rhythmic beeping of monitors was the soundtrack to my life, a constant measure of crises averted and lives hanging in the balance. I remember I was titrating a dopamine drip for a patient in cardiogenic shock when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my brother, Richard. Richard rarely called during the day. His calls were usually reserved for Sunday evenings, a perfunctory check-in that felt more like a shareholder update than a conversation between siblings. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I ducked into the staff break room, the smell of stale coffee and microwave popcorn thick in the air. "Richard, is everything okay?" I asked, my voice hushed. His voice was clipped, efficient, the way it always was when he was delivering information rather than exchanging pleasantries. "It's Dad. He had a fall." My own heart seemed to skip a beat, mimicking the arrhythmias on the monitors outside. "What? Is he okay? Where is he?" I was already mentally calculating how quickly I could get my charge nurse to cover for me. He's fine," Richard said, a touch of impatience in his tone. "Relatively. His neighbor, Mrs. Gable, found him. He's at St. Mary's. They're saying it's a small fracture in his hip. But that's not the real issue, Maggie." I could hear him pacing, the faint sound of his expensive leather shoes on what I imagined was a polished hardwood floor 1,000 miles away. "The doctor called me. They're concerned about his cognitive state. Confusion. Memory lapses. They mentioned the word, progressive." That word hung in the air between us, a heavy, shapeless thing. Progressive. A one-way street. I sank onto a worn plastic chair, the dopamine drip forgotten for a moment. My father, Arthur, had always been a rock. A quiet, steady man who smelled of sawdust and old spice. He'd built the house I grew up in with his own 2 hands, his quiet competence a source of constant comfort. The idea of his mind, the place that held all his stories and his love for my late mother, beginning to fray was unthinkable. "What do we do?" I whispered, the question aimed more at the universe than at my brother. "Well," Richard began, and I could already hear the shift in his voice, the move from concerned son to CEO of the family crisis. "I've already done some preliminary research. There are some excellent facilities out there. Places with dedicated memory care units, 24-hour nursing. I can start making some calls, vetting them. The sale of the house should cover a significant portion of the initial costs. It's the most logical solution." Logical. The word landed like a stone. I looked around the break room at the tired faces of my colleagues, people who spent their lives dealing with the messy, illogical, and deeply human business of caring for others. There was nothing logical about love or fear or the terror of being old and alone. "A facility?" I said, the words tasting like ash. "Richard, he would hate that. That house is his whole world. It's where Mom—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Richard sighed, a long-suffering sound I knew well. Maggie, let's be practical. You're in a demanding job. I'm across the country. We can't provide the level of care he's going to need. This is about his safety. It's the responsible thing to do. That night after my shift, I drove to St. Mary's. The hospital corridors were quiet, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and illness. I found my father in a room at the end of a long hall. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, his strong, calloused hands lying still on the starchy white blanket. His eyes, usually a bright, intelligent blue, were clouded with confusion and pain. He saw me and a flicker of recognition, of relief, crossed his face. Maggie, he whispered, his voice frail. I sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand. It felt cool and dry. I'm here, Dad, I said, my own voice thick with unshed tears. We didn't talk much. I just sat with him, a silent presence against the encroaching shadows. In that quiet room, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, I made a decision. Richard could talk about logic and responsibility from his corner office 3 time zones away. He could make spreadsheets and vet facilities. But I was here. I was the one holding my father's hand. I was the one who could see the terror in his eyes at the thought of leaving his home. The next day, I went to my hospital administrator and requested an indefinite leave of absence. I called my landlord and gave my 30 days notice. I packed up my small apartment, the life I had carefully built for myself, into cardboard boxes. I was moving home. When I told Richard my plan, his reaction was exactly what I had expected. Disbelief followed by a lecture. You're what? Margaret, that's insane. You're throwing away your career. For how long? This isn't a sprained ankle we're talking about. This is a long-term degenerative condition. You're not equipped to handle this alone. I'm a nurse, Richard, I reminded him, my voice tight. I'm more equipped than you think. And I won't be alone. I'll have Dad. And what about the financial aspect? He pressed, always the pragmatist. Who's going to pay the bills? The mortgage? The property taxes? You won't have an income. I have savings, I said, though I knew they wouldn't last forever. And you said you would help. I said I'd help with a solution, he retorted. Not with subsidizing this sentimental fantasy. Fine. Do what you want. But don't come crying to me when it all becomes too much. I'm telling you, you're making a huge mistake. He didn't understand. He couldn't. For him, the house was an asset on a balance sheet. Our father was a problem to be managed. For me, they were both home. And I was not going to abandon them. The first year was a blur of adjustment. I settled into my old childhood bedroom, the floral wallpaper a ghost of my teenage years. I learned the new rhythms of my father's life, a slow and winding dance dictated by his medication schedule, his good days and his bad. The good days were a gift. We would sit on the back porch, my father wrapped in a thick wool blanket, and he would tell me stories about his courtship with my mother, his voice growing stronger with the clarity of the memory. We'd watch old black and white movies, and for a few hours he would be my dad again, sharp and funny, his eyes twinkling. The bad days were a trial. There were times he didn't know who I was, his eyes looking right through me with a vacant fear that broke my heart. There was the frustration of him being unable to perform simple tasks, the anger at his own body's betrayal turning inward or sometimes outward at me. There was the physical toll of helping him bathe, of getting him dressed, of catching him when his legs gave out. My life shrank to the 4 walls of that house. My friends stopped calling as often, unsure of what to say. My world became a small, contained universe of doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and the endless, exhausting vigilance of being a full-time caregiver. Richard's support was exactly what he had promised, financial and distant. He set up an automatic transfer to my bank account every month, an amount he had deemed sufficient for basic expenses. With the money came the oversight. Our weekly calls became audits. I saw the grocery bill was higher this month, Maggie. Are you buying organic? It's really not necessary. The utility bill seems steep. Are you remembering to turn off the lights in rooms you're not using? I got a quote for a new water heater. The one you got is $200 more than the one I found online. You have to be more diligent with these things. Each question was a small paper cut. He never asked, "How is Dad's spirit?" He asked, "How is the budget?" He never asked, "How are you, Maggie? How are you coping?" He asked, "Are you sticking to the plan?" I felt like a line manager in one of his corporate departments, responsible for an underperforming asset. The house was the failing factory and Dad and I were the inefficient workers. One night about a year and a half in, Dad had a particularly bad spell. A urinary tract infection, a common affliction in the elderly, had sent him into a state of delirium. His fever spiked to 103 and he was thrashing in his bed, shouting for my mother. I called 911, my nursing training kicking in, my voice calm and steady on the phone even as my hands trembled. At the emergency room, while we waited for the antibiotics to start working, I called Richard. I needed to hear my brother's voice. I needed some semblance of family support. He answered on the third ring, his voice sharp. Margaret? It's after midnight here. What's wrong? I explained the situation, my voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. He's delirious, Richard. It was so scary. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I waited for the words. I'm so sorry, Maggie. That sounds awful. Is there anything I can do? Instead, what I got was, did you call an ambulance? You know they charge a fortune for that, right? You probably could have just driven him. I was stunned into silence. I sat there on the cold vinyl chair in the ER waiting room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and I felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in my chest. He wasn't just detached, he was cruel. His concern wasn't for his father's well-being or his sister's distress. It was for the impact on his wallet. I have to go, Richard, I said, my voice flat. The doctor is coming. I hung up before he could reply. I sat there for a long moment, the phone heavy in my hand. Then I pulled my bag onto my lap and took out a small, spiral-bound notebook I used for grocery lists. I turned to a clean page. At the top I wrote the date. And then I started writing. February 11th. 1:45 a.m. Rushed Dad to the ER with a high fever and delirium from a UTI. He kept calling for Mom. Sat with him for 5 hours until he was stable. Called Richard for support. He asked if the ambulance was expensive. It wasn't for him. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. It was a way to validate my own reality, to record the truth of my experience against the gaslighting and dismissal I received from the one person who should have been my partner in this. That notebook became my secret confidant. It lived in the drawer of my bedside table. I never missed an entry. April 3rd. 2:20 p.m. Dad and I planted tomatoes in the backyard. He could only sit in his chair and direct me, but he smiled. A real, genuine smile. It was the first one in weeks. Richard called to inform me that I should switch to a cheaper internet provider. July 19th. 4 a.m. A nightmare woke Dad up. He was convinced there was an intruder in the house. I spent 2 hours walking with him through every room, opening every closet, showing him we were safe until he finally fell asleep in his armchair. He was holding my hand so tightly. I didn't move until the sun came up. October 28th. All day. Fought with the insurance company on the phone. They were refusing to cover a new type of medication his neurologist recommended. After 7 hours in 5 different departments, I finally got it approved. Richard sent an email with a link to an article titled, The 5 Ways You're Wasting Money on Your Parents' Healthcare. The ledger grew page by page, a silent testament to the invisible, unpaid, and unacknowledged labor of love. It was a chronicle not of expenses but of existence. The currency was not dollars, but hours of lost sleep, moments of terror, and flashes of transcendent joy. It was the story of my life. Around the 2-year mark, during a period of unusual lucidity for my father, we had a conversation that would prove to be pivotal. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, dust motes dancing in the golden light. Dad was quiet, stirring his tea. Maggie, he said, his voice surprisingly firm. I worry about him. I knew immediately who he meant. Richard? I asked gently. He nodded, not looking at me. He's a good man in his way. But he's practical. To a fault. He sees life as a series of problems to be solved efficiently. He doesn't see the heart of things. He finally lifted his gaze to meet mine, and his blue eyes were sharp and clear. I don't want him making decisions for me, Maggie. Not when I can't make them for myself. A lump formed in my throat. What do you want, Dad? I want you, he said simply. I trust you. You see me. You know what your mother would have wanted. I want you to be the one. The only one. Can we Can we make that official? The next week I took an afternoon off from my duties. I hired a home health aide for a few hours and drove my father to the office of a local estate lawyer. The lawyer, a kind woman named Mrs. Davis, explained the documents patiently and clearly. A living will, a healthcare directive, and a durable medical power of attorney. My father listened intently, nodding. When it came time to sign, his hand trembled, but his signature was decisive. He named me as his sole agent, giving me complete and final authority over all his medical and care-related decisions. I watched him sign, a profound sadness mixing with a sense of solemn duty. We were preparing for a future where he would no longer be himself, and it was heartbreaking. But as he passed the pen back to the lawyer, he looked at me and gave me a small, reassuring nod. We were a team. I took the notarized official copies home and placed them in the lockbox where my father kept his important papers, right next to his army discharge papers and his marriage certificate. I never mentioned it to Richard. What was the point? It would only start a fight, an accusation that I was manipulating our father, that I was trying to seize control. It was easier to just let it be, a silent shield I hoped I would never have to use. The years passed. The ledger filled with more entries. My savings dwindled. My world remained small, but it was a world rich with a quiet purpose. I learned to find joy in the smallest things. The way my father's face would light up when I put on his favorite Glenn Miller record, the comfortable silence as we sat together on the porch swing, the simple, profound act of holding his hand. I was tired, yes. Deeply tired in a way that sleep couldn't always fix. But I was not unhappy. I was where I was supposed to be. Then 2 weeks ago the phone call came that signaled the beginning of the end. It was Richard. His tone was different. It wasn't the usual clipped, businesslike impatience. It was something else. A kind of purposeful gravity. "Maggie, I'm coming out," he announced without any preamble. "I've booked a flight for next Tuesday. I'll be there for a few days." "Oh," I said, surprised. "That's great. Dad will be happy to see you." "This isn't just a visit, Maggie," he said, his voice dropping. "It's time. We need to have a serious talk about the future. This situation, it isn't sustainable anymore. We need to make some real decisions." The word, sustainable, was a red flag. It was corporate speak, a word used to describe business models, not a human life. "What do you mean, not sustainable?" I asked, a familiar coldness seeping into my veins. "We're doing okay, Richard." "Are you?" he countered. "From what I can tell, you're barely treading water. The house is falling into disrepair, Dad's condition is not improving, and you have no life of your own. It's been 5 years. It's enough. I'm coming to sort things out." Sorting things out. It sounded less like a promise of help and more like a threat. For the next week, a sense of foreboding hung over the house like a damp fog. I tried to push it away to focus on the daily routine, but it was always there, a low hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. I found myself looking around the house at the worn armchair where Dad sat, at the pencil marks on the doorframe measuring our heights as children, at the faint, faded photograph of my mother on the mantelpiece. This wasn't a situation. It was a life. It was our home. Richard arrived on a Tuesday just as he said he would. He pulled up in a sleek black rental sedan that looked ridiculously out of place on our quiet middle-class street. He stepped out wearing a charcoal gray suit and a crisp white shirt, looking more like he was heading to a board meeting than to visit his ailing father. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a small overnight bag in the other. He gave me a brisk, one-armed hug on the porch. "Margaret, you look tired," he said. It wasn't an expression of sympathy. It was an observation, a data point for the case he was already building. His interaction with Dad was excruciating to watch. He strode into the living room where Dad was sitting in his chair, watching an old Western. "Dad. Good to see you," Richard boomed, his voice unnaturally loud as if our father's hearing was the primary issue. Dad looked up, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Richard? Is that you?" "The one and only," he said, clapping him on the shoulder a little too hard. "How are you feeling?" Keeping this one on her toes. He winked at me. I forced a tight-lipped smile. Richard's attempts at bonding were a disaster. He tried to engage Dad in conversations about topics that were now far beyond his grasp. "Remember that stock tip I gave you back in '08, Dad? The one about the tech startup? Man, we should have bought more of that." Dad just stared at him, his brow furrowed, trying to catch the thread of a conversation that was moving too fast. After a few minutes of these failed attempts, Richard would sigh, a theatrical long-suffering sound meant for my ears. "See?" he would mouth to me from across the room, shaking his head sadly. "He's really not there anymore." He was assessing him, testing him, and judging him for failing. He wasn't connecting, he was collecting evidence. For the next 2 days, Richard was a whirlwind of quiet, purposeful activity. He walked through the house with his smartphone held up, taking pictures of the peeling paint on the windowsills, the small water stain on the ceiling of the upstairs bathroom, the overgrown rose bushes in the backyard. He would murmur things under his breath like deferred maintenance and significant capital required. He was not seeing a home filled with memories. He was conducting a property inspection, tallying up the flaws that were hurting its resale value. He made phone calls in hushed, serious tones, pacing on the back porch. I once overheard him through the screen door. "Yes, a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath. Needs some work, obviously. What's the market like in that zip code right now?" He was talking to a real estate agent. My blood ran cold. He was moving forward with his plan without even having the courtesy to discuss it with me first. He also started planting seeds of doubt not just with me but with others. He called our Aunt Carol our mother's sister, a woman who had always been slightly in awe of Richard's financial success and prone to anxiety. "I'm just so worried about both of them, Aunt Carol," I heard him say, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Margaret is so isolated, and she's in complete denial about the severity of Dad's condition. I feel like I have to be the adult here." The next day Aunt Carol called me, her voice fluttering with worry. "Oh, Margaret dear." Richard called me. "He's so concerned. Maybe he's right. This is an awful lot for one person to bear. You can't do it all yourself. You need to let him help." It was a classic pincer move. He was isolating me, making me out to be the unreasonable, emotional one, while he was the responsible, logical adult. He was building a consensus that I was not a part of. The gaslighting was relentless and subtle. "Are you sure the doctor said he was stable, Maggie? Because from what I'm observing, there's been a steep decline. Maybe you're just too close to see it. Or, I know you're emotionally attached to this house, but you have to think about what's best for him. Is a drafty old house with steep stairs really the safest place? And the most cutting of all, you've put your life on hold for 5 years. Don't you want it back? I'm trying to give you that gift. A chance to start over." He framed my love as a prison and his plan as my liberation. It was masterful, manipulative, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. The announcement when it came was not a discussion. It was a decree. He called a family meeting on the 3rd day of his visit. He suggested Dad have a nap in his room so we could talk freely. The 3 of us, Richard, a roped-in and nervous Aunt Carol, and me, sat at the dining room table. The afternoon light was gray and flat. Richard opened his sleek leather briefcase and took out a folder. He was in his element. He was in the boardroom. "Okay," he began all business. "Let's talk roadmap. I've had a frank conversation with a top real estate agent in the area, a woman who specializes in quick sales. She's confident we can have the house listed by the end of the month and sold within the quarter." He pushed a glossy business card across the table. I didn't touch it. "The market is hot right now, but this house needs work. We'll have to list it as is, which will affect the price, but the speed of the sale is the priority." He then pulled out a brochure, its pages crisp and shiny. The cover showed a sprawling modern building surrounded by unnaturally green lawns. The name was printed in a serene, looping font, Golden Meadows Senior Living. "I've also done extensive due diligence on placement options," he continued, tapping the brochure. "Golden Meadows is the best in the state. It has a dedicated memory care wing, a fantastic staff-to-resident ratio, and a full schedule of activities. I've already spoken to their intake coordinator. They have a room available." He looked from me to Aunt Carol, a look of self-satisfied accomplishment on his face. "The proceeds from the sale of the house will cover the buy-in fee and the first 3 to 4 years of fees. I've run the numbers." He slid a printed spreadsheet across the table next to the brochure. It was full of columns and figures, a cold, black-and-white accounting of my father's future. "I'll of course cover any and all shortfalls after that. The financial side is handled." He closed the folder with a soft, final thud. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man who had solved a complex problem with elegant precision. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and expectation. So, I'll need you to start going through Dad's personal effects, deciding what to keep and what to get rid of. The agent is coming on Friday morning to do a final walkthrough and take photos. We'll need to have the place decluttered by then. He didn't ask for my opinion. He didn't ask for my consent. He had come, he had assessed, and he had decided. In his mind, the meeting was over. The plan was in motion. All that was left was for me to execute his orders. I just looked at him, the spreadsheet and the glossy brochure sitting in front of me like a verdict. I felt a strange and terrible calm settle over me. The anxiety of the past week vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He had no idea what was coming. The family meeting, the real one, was just about to begin. The air in the dining room was thick with Richard's self-satisfaction. He was looking at me, waiting for me to acquiesce, perhaps to even thank him for his decisive intervention. Aunt Carol was nervously pleating the edge of the tablecloth, her eyes darting between us. The silence stretched. I let it hang there, a heavy blanket over the table. Richard's confident posture began to falter. He shifted in his chair, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He was used to people responding to him immediately. My quiet stillness was throwing him off his rhythm. "Well," he prompted. "Maggie? Did you hear me? The agent is coming on Friday." I finally met his gaze. My own must have been unreadable because he looked momentarily confused. There were no tears, no pleading, no angry outburst. Just a profound, settled calm that I hadn't felt in years. "I heard you, Richard," I said, my voice even and low. "I heard every word." I took a slow breath. "You've prepared a lot of documents. You have your brochures, your business cards, your spreadsheets. You've clearly put a lot of work into the financial and logistical side of this. You see this as a business transaction." Richard puffed up slightly, taking it as a compliment. "Of course. It's a serious matter. It requires a serious, organized approach. Emotions just cloud the issue." "I agree," I said, and a small smile might have touched my lips. "It is a serious matter. Which is why I've also been keeping a record." I reached down beside my chair and lifted a simple spiral-bound notebook onto the table. It was thick with use, its cover soft and worn at the edges. I placed it squarely in the middle of the table, next to his glossy brochure for Golden Meadows. It looked so humble, so ordinary next to his professional presentation. Richard scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "A record? A record of what? Household expenses? I told you I have that covered. I review the bank statements every month. We don't need your handwritten notes, Maggie." "No," I said, my eyes not leaving his. "It's not a ledger of money. It's a ledger of time." I opened the notebook. The pages were filled with my neat, compact handwriting. I didn't need to search for the pages. I knew them by heart. I looked directly at Richard, letting Aunt Carol and the entire room fade into the periphery. "June 4th, 4 years ago," I began, my voice clear and steady. "Dad woke up at 3 in the morning from a nightmare. He thought he was back in the war. He was terrified. I sat with him on the floor by his bed and held his hand until the sun came up. You were in Singapore that week, closing that big tech deal you were so proud of." Richard's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to say something, but I continued, my voice gaining strength. "September 12th, 3 years ago. I spent 8 hours on the phone with the insurance company. They had denied coverage for his physical therapy, calling it non-essential. I was transferred 9 times. I was hung up on twice. But by 5 o'clock I got it approved. Dad was able to get the therapy that helped him walk without a cane for another 6 months. You were on vacation in Tuscany. You sent us a postcard of the Leaning Tower of Pisa." Aunt Carol had stopped fidgeting with the tablecloth. She was staring at the notebook as if it were a holy text. Richard's face had gone rigid. "Last Tuesday, Richard," I pressed on, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense. "Just last week, Dad developed a fever. It was 102.3. I was worried about sepsis. I sponged him down with cool cloths every 20 minutes for 6 hours, all through the night until it finally broke. He was shivering, but he was lucid enough to be scared. I told him stories about when we were kids to keep his mind off it." I paused, letting the image settle in the room. "The next morning you called. You didn't ask about Dad. You called to complain that the gardener I had hired was charging $10 an hour more than the service you'd found online. The room was utterly silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out the seconds of all those nights I had just described. Richard's face was pale, his usual confident, tanned complexion now a pasty gray. The condescension had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He looked cornered. This is emotional blackmail," he stammered, his voice losing its authoritative timbre. "It has no bearing on the facts. The fact is he needs professional round-the-clock care. The fact is this house is a money pit. The fact is I am his son, and I am making the responsible decision for his welfare." He slammed his hand on the table, trying to reclaim control through force. The spreadsheet and brochure jumped. I didn't flinch. I let his outburst echo and die in the quiet room. Then I leaned forward slightly. "Actually, Richard," I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're not." I reached into the bag at my feet again and pulled out a single folded document. It was a thick, creamy paper, bearing the letterhead of an attorney's office. I unfolded it deliberately and slid it across the polished surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a suspicious whisper. "This," I said, "is a durable medical power of attorney. Dad signed it 2.5 years ago. It was witnessed, notarized, and a copy has been on file with his primary care physician ever since." Richard snatched the document. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, then darted to the bottom of the page. He saw our father's signature, shaky but distinct. He saw the name and signature of the witness, Mrs. Davis, the attorney. He saw the raised, embossed seal of the notary public. The color drained completely from his face. He looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. "It gives me," I continued, spelling it out for him as if he were a child, "and me alone, the final and absolute legal authority to make any and all decisions regarding our father's medical care, his treatment, and specifically," I paused for emphasis, "his living arrangements." He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and betrayal. "You went behind my back. You had him sign this. When he wasn't in his right mind." "He was perfectly lucid that day, Richard," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "He knew exactly what he was signing. He signed it because he was afraid. He was afraid that one day, you would do exactly what you are trying to do today. He was afraid you would see him as a line item, a problem to be managed, an asset to be liquidated. And he wanted to make sure that the person making decisions for him was the one who held his hand when he was scared, not the one who was calculating the cost of an ambulance ride." I stood up then, the movement feeling slow and deliberate. I looked from my brother's stunned, ashen face to my aunt, who was now staring at me with a newfound respect, a dawning understanding in her eyes. "Dad is staying here," I declared, my voice resonating in the quiet room. "In his home. With me. This discussion is over. You came here to sort things out. Well, consider them sorted." I pushed my chair back in, the sound of the wood scraping against the floor loud and final. "The house is not for sale. My father is not for sale. And my love for him is not a business you get to shut down because it's no longer profitable." I turned my back on them both, on the glossy brochure and the useless spreadsheet and the brother who had so profoundly and completely misunderstood everything. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said without looking back. "I need to go check on my father." I walked out of the dining room, leaving him there with the evidence of his defeat, and a ledger full of time he could never buy back. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to tick louder as I walked away, each tick a small victory. I didn't go to my father's room immediately. I went to the kitchen and stood at the sink, gripping the cool porcelain edge, my knuckles white. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. The adrenaline of the confrontation coursed through me, making my hands shake. I had done it. After 5 years of biting my tongue, of absorbing his criticisms, of feeling small and incompetent under his judgmental gaze, I had finally stood up to him. I had spoken my truth, and I had backed it up with the one thing he couldn't argue with: legal authority. A moment later, I heard the scrape of a chair from the dining room, followed by heavy, angry footsteps. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face a thunderous mask of rage. His expensive suit seemed rumpled, his composure completely shattered. "You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. You think you're so noble playing the martyr. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I know exactly what I've done, I replied, turning to face him. I was surprised to find my own voice was steady. The fear was gone. I've honored Dad's wishes. Dad's wishes? He scoffed, taking a step into the kitchen. Dad doesn't know what he wants anymore. I am trying to secure his future to ensure he has professional care. You're condemning him to subpar care in a crumbling house, all to satisfy your own selfish emotional needs. My selfish needs? I let out a short, humorless laugh. Richard, for 5 years, my only need has been to make sure Dad is safe and feels loved. What need of yours were you satisfying? The need to have everything neat and tidy on a balance sheet? The need to control every outcome? He was momentarily speechless, his jaw working silently. From the dining room I heard Aunt Carol murmuring, "Richard, maybe we should just, maybe she's right. You stay out of this," he snapped over his shoulder at her before turning his fury back to me. "Fine. You want to do this? You want to be in charge? Then you're on your own." Completely. His eyes were cold, his words precise and cruel. "The money stops. As of today. Not another dime for the mortgage, the taxes, the groceries, the utilities. Nothing. You want to run this little charity operation? You fund it yourself. Let's see how long your noble sacrifice lasts when the bills start piling up. Don't come crying to me when the bank forecloses on this precious house of yours." It was his final, most powerful weapon. Money. The tool he had always used to control, to judge, and to feel superior. He expected me to crumble, to beg. He expected me to see the error of my ways when faced with financial ruin. I just looked at him, at this angry, wounded man who was my brother. And all I felt was a profound sense of pity. "I never have come crying to you, Richard," I said quietly. "And I won't start now. Goodbye." I turned my back on him and walked out of the kitchen, heading for my father's room. I heard a string of choked, furious sounds behind me, and then the thunderous slam of the front door. The house rattled. The silence that followed was deep and absolute. Aunt Carol scurried out a few minutes later, murmuring a flustered apology without making eye contact. And then it was quiet. Just the ticking of the clock and the gentle rhythm of the house breathing around me. I finally went to my father's room. I pushed the door open gently. He was awake, sitting up against his pillows. He had clearly heard the shouting, the slammed door. His eyes were wide and anxious. "Is he gone?" he asked, his voice a frail whisper. I walked over and sat on the edge of his bed, taking his hand in mine. It was warm. "Yes, Dad," I said, my voice soft. "He's gone." He looked at me, his gaze searching my face. He saw the stress, the exhaustion, but he also must have seen the resolve. He squeezed my hand. A slow, faint smile touched his lips. "You're a good daughter, Maggie," he said, his voice gaining a little of its old strength. "A good, strong daughter. Your mother. She would be so proud of you." And in that moment, the validation I had spent years secretly craving from my brother was handed to me by my father, and it was 1,000 times more meaningful. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed during the confrontation pricked at my eyes. They weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of relief. The war was over. I had held the line. We were safe. That night, after I had helped Dad with his dinner and settled him in for the night, I sat alone at the kitchen table. Richard's threat echoed in my mind. "The money stops." I pulled out my bank statements, a calculator, and a blank notepad. For hours I went over the numbers. The mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, the utilities, the cost of food and Dad's medications. Richard was right about one thing. The monthly stipend he had been providing was essential. Without it, my savings would be gone in less than 6 months. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to prick at the edges of my newfound calm. For a moment I felt a wave of panic. What had I done? Had I won the battle only to lose the war? Had I doomed us to financial ruin out of pride? I took a deep breath and looked over at the ledger which I had left on the table. I flipped through its pages, the chronicle of the last 5 years. I saw the late nights, the scary fevers, the small, hard-won victories. I saw a story of resilience. I had navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the healthcare system. I had learned to be a physical therapist, a pharmacist, a chef, and a 24-hour nurse. I had faced down fear and exhaustion and despair, and I had always found a way through. This was just another problem to be solved. Richard saw money as the only solution because it was the only tool he had. But I had others. I had my skills, my determination, and a love for my father that was more powerful than any bank account. I started to write on the fresh sheet of paper. It wasn't a budget of scarcity. It was a plan of action. I spent the next few days making calls. I started with Dad's social worker at the hospital, a wonderful woman named Maria who had always been kind to me. I explained the situation, that my financial support had been cut off. She listened patiently and then spent an hour on the phone with me, telling me about local and state programs for caregivers I had never known existed. There were property tax exemptions for seniors. There were grants available to help with home modifications. There was a respite care program that could provide a certified aide for a few hours a week free of charge to give me a break. By the end of the call, I felt a sliver of hope. It wouldn't replace Richard's money, but it was a start. It was a safety net I didn't know I had. Next, I thought about my own skills. I couldn't go back to a full-time hospital job, but that didn't mean I couldn't work. I had 5 years of intense practical experience in home-based elder care. I knew the challenges, the fears, the practicalities. I drew up a simple flyer on my computer. Margaret Evans, RN. In-home care consultant. Feeling overwhelmed caring for a loved one at home? Let me help you navigate the system, create a safe environment, and develop a sustainable care plan. I printed 50 copies at the local library. I posted them on the community bulletin boards at the senior center, the grocery store, and the local churches. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The silence was deafening. The number in my bank account loomed large in my mind. I started to second-guess myself. Then one afternoon the phone rang. It was a woman named Sarah. Her voice was frayed with exhaustion, the same kind of bone-deep weariness I knew so well. She was trying to care for her mother who had suffered a stroke and she was drowning. "I saw your flyer at the church," she said, her voice cracking. I don't know what to do. The doctors just give you a pile of papers and send you home. I'm so afraid I'm going to do something wrong." I spent an hour on the phone with her, just listening. Then I started asking questions the same way I would assess a patient. I gave her some simple, practical advice on medication management and preventing bedsores. I told her about the respite care program Maria had told me about. At the end of the call, she was crying, but this time they were tears of relief. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. "Let's call this one a free consultation," I said. "Just pay it forward someday." The next day she called back. "My mother's bridge club," she said. "There are 3 other women in it who are going through the same thing. They all want to hire you." And just like that, I had a business. It wasn't a high-powered career. It was small, local, and deeply personal. I would go to people's homes, sit at their kitchen tables and help them. I would review their loved ones' medication lists, suggest simple home modifications to improve safety, and connect them with community resources. I charged a modest hourly rate. It wasn't much, but combined with the assistance programs, it was enough. We were going to be okay. Life settled into a new rhythm. A better one. I had my clients who gave me a sense of purpose beyond my own 4 walls, and I had the support of the community programs which eased my financial burden. The respite care was a revelation. For 4 hours every Thursday, a wonderful aide named Gloria would come and stay with Dad. The first time I just went to a coffee shop and sat there for 2 hours reading a novel. The simple act of being somewhere else, of not being on high alert, felt like a luxury vacation. I started building a new kind of family. Sarah, my first client, became a close friend. We would meet for coffee on my respite days, sharing stories and finding humor in the absurdities of caregiving. My next-door neighbor, a retired mechanic named George, started mowing our lawn for free, and would often leave a container of his wife's famous lasagna on our doorstep. People were kind. I had been so focused on the one person who wasn't there for me that I had failed to see all the people who were. About a year after the showdown, a package arrived. It was a small, flat box, sent via courier from Richard City. My stomach tightened. I half expected it to be a legal summons. I opened it cautiously. Inside there was no letter, just a check. It was for a substantial amount, roughly what he used to send me over 3 months. Tucked into the memo line of the check was a short, stilted note in Richard's cramped, precise handwriting. It said simply, "For Dad's expenses. R." It wasn't an apology. There was no admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. It was just a check. A transactional gesture. The old me would have been elated. I would have seen it as a victory, a sign that he had finally come around. but the woman I had become in the past year simply looked at it. I thought about the fear I'd felt when he first cut me off, and the strength I had found in overcoming it. I had built a life, a sustainable, supportive life without him. I didn't need his money anymore. And I realized with a startling clarity that accepting it would feel like a step backward. It would be letting him back in, allowing him to believe that money could still be the solution, that it could paper over the cracks in our broken relationship. I took the check and I put it on the mantelpiece, right next to the faded photograph of my mother. I didn't cash it. I didn't tear it up. I just left it there, a silent reminder of a battle won, and of a relationship that was far too complicated to be fixed by a simple financial transaction. It was a symbol of my independence. Looking back now, I see that the ledger I kept was never really for Richard. It was for me. It was the proof I needed that what I was doing mattered, that my quiet, thankless work had immense value that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. My brother saw our father's life in terms of profit and loss, of assets and liabilities. But a life isn't a business. Love isn't a commodity. The real currency of care isn't money, it's presence. It's the willingness to show up, to hold a hand, to listen, to be there when the lights go out. I learned that my worth was not determined by my career, my income, or my brother's approval. It was forged in the quiet hours of the night, in the patient repetition of a story, in the simple, profound act of caring for another human being. My empowerment didn't come from a dramatic courtroom victory or a sudden inheritance. It came from the slow, steady work of building a life on my own terms, of finding strength in my own skills, and of discovering a community that understood that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up. And now I want to turn it over to you. Have you ever had to fight for a loved one's wishes against someone who just didn't understand? Share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter and they deserve to be heard. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you so much for joining me today, for listening to my story. Remember that your value is inherent. It isn't granted by others and it can never be taken away. I wish you all strength and peace on your own journeys.